You were already in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, in traffic, washing dishes, looking out the window aimlessly, when a song began to play. It was nothing you had chosen. It arrived on the radio, in a random playlist, through someone's phone nearby. And something happened within you before any conscious thought could organize itself, an internal halt, a kind of recognition that had no logical explanation, because you had never heard that song before. But what it said seemed to have been written about something you had carried for a long time without being able to put into words. You have lived this moment. It is not nostalgia. It is not a coincidence of mood. It is something more precise than that, a kind of sound mirror, an encounter between what was inside you and what someone somewhere transformed into melody. And for a short, intense moment, you felt what you perhaps haven't felt in weeks or months, that your story, with all the layers it has, with everything that doesn't fit into dinner conversation and doesn't fit into a photo caption, was seen. It was recognized. It was recorded somewhere beyond yourself. This video is about this phenomenon, why it happens, what is happening in your brain and your spirit when a song finds exactly what you carry, why pain transfigured into beauty has the power to make people cry without knowing why, and what this reveals about what you are being called to do with what you have lived. Because there is a dimension of your story that has not yet received the format that allows it to be understood by those on the outside. And this format, this transfiguration of weight into something that others can recognize and carry with them, may be the most unexpected and necessary contribution you have to make. Stay here, because what comes next will change how you understand the relationship between what you suffered and what you have to offer. If you are not yet subscribed to this channel, do it now before continuing. This space was built for those who have already understood that the deepest life does not have a public playlist yet.
Attention, you need to prepare now. I put together an exclusive resource for those who feel set apart for something greater, but live surrounded by noise, distractions, and mental overload. This is a 30-day journey that will transform your life, a guided path to armor your mind and prepare for what's coming, with daily practices of focus, boundaries, and discipline. Stop negotiating with the noise. Learn to spot distractions before they control you and strengthen your mind. Also available in an immersive audio version. Over 10,000 readers have already transformed their lives through the 30-day journey. Thousands of people have already started this transformation. People like you, who were tired of living in the fog, ordinary people who decided to stop accepting mental chaos. Take advantage of this limited time offer only this month. Access your link just below in the pinned comment.
But it is being composed. The pain that has no words, and why music finds what language cannot reach. There is an experience, you know, and that is almost impossible to explain to someone who has not lived it in exactly the same way. It is the experience of carrying something that is real, that has weight, that shaped who you are in structural and permanent ways, but that does not have a format that allows it to be transmitted in ordinary conversation. You tried at some point, you tried to explain to someone what that season was, what that loss cost, what that decision produced internally, and you realized, in the middle of speaking, that words were reducing what was three-dimensional to something too flat, that the other person was listening with the level of attention that daily life allows, which is real, which is well-intentioned, but which was not enough to reach what you were trying to transmit. And you kept simplifying, summarizing, until what came out of your mouth was a version so abbreviated of what was real that it seemed almost unfaithful to the original. This experience has a name in neuroscience. It is the consequence of the difference in processing between what researchers call declarative memory, the memory you can verbalize, sequence, narrate, and implicit, somatic, and emotional memory, which is processed in regions of the brain that do not have direct access to the language system. Researchers from the Department of Neuroscience at McGill University in Canada, one of the most advanced institutions in the world in the neuroscience of music, documented something that will change how you understand what happens when a song stops you in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Music accesses the limbic system, the emotional processing center, through a pathway that does not pass through the prefrontal cortex. which is where language resides. In other words, music arrives before thought. It finds what is stored in the layers that conversation does not reach, and produces a response that the body registers before any conscious articulation is possible. The shiver, the contraction in the chest, the strange sensation that someone understood something you had given up trying to explain. This is not fantasy or suggestion. It is the encounter of a sound frequency with a memory that was stored below the threshold of language, in layers that only music and certain contemplative experiences can access with such precision. And this explains something that goes beyond neuroscience. It explains why the Psalms work in a way that no other sacred text reproduces with the same emotional intensity. It explains why certain songs make people cry without knowing why. And it explains why the transfiguration of pain into art is one of the oldest and most powerful forms of testimony that exists. The three figures who sang what could not be merely spoken. There is a pattern in the sacred text that is so consistent it seems intentional, because it is. In moments of greatest emotional intensity, at points where the experience was too dense to be contained in ordinary language, the people who carried the story of God with Israel did not just speak, they sang. Miriam, Moses' older sister, the girl who had stood guard on the riverbank watching the basket that carried her baby brother toward Pharaoh's palace. Decades later, after the Red Sea closed over the Egyptian army and the people finally stepped onto the shore on the other side, not the side of slavery but the side of freedom, Miriam did not wait for someone to organize the celebration. The text of Exodus 15 records that she took a tambourine and began to sing. Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. What is significant in Miriam's song is not the lyrics, it is the moment. Those people had gone through an experience that completely exceeded the capacity of ordinary language to process. They had just crossed the impossible. The emotion of that moment, the relief, the terror still in the body, the gratitude that had no adequate scale, the awareness that they had witnessed something for which there was no precedent, could not be contained in prose. It needed the dimension that only song offers, the rhythm that organizes emotional chaos, the melody that gives shape to the shapeless, the collective act of voices that turns a private experience into a shared witness. Miriam was not performing for an audience. She was transfiguring what the body still carried into something the spirit could integrate. And the text records that the people followed her, because what she was doing named what everyone was feeling without anyone knowing how to name it. What Miriam's story says to you is precise. There is a way to process what you went through that goes beyond conversation, beyond analysis, beyond the summary you offer when someone asks, "So how was it?" There is a dimension of your experience that needs another format to be integrated, and that, when it receives that format, not only releases you, but becomes something that other people recognize in their own bodies. Leave a like now if you have made it this far, and something in you recognize this weight of carrying an experience that does not fit into ordinary conversation. This gesture is not about engagement, it is your recognition that this content is naming something real. Now Asaph, he is one of the most important musicians in the entire biblical tradition, and the least famous outside the circle of those who read the Psalms carefully. Asaph was the leader of the musicians appointed by David to serve before the Ark of the Covenant, a man of extraordinary musical and spiritual capacity, with a prominent position at the center of Israel's liturgical life. And Psalm 73, which bears his name, begins with one of the most honestly disturbing confessions in the entire sacred text. Truly God is good to Israel. But as for me, my feet had almost stumbled, my steps had nearly slipped, for I was envious of the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. Asaph, the chief musician, the worship leader, the man appointed to maintain the spiritual frequency of a nation, was on the brink of a collapse of faith because he was looking at those who did not deserve it and were receiving and comparing it with what he had given and had not yet seen returned. And the text does not hide this. It does not edit what would be theologically inconvenient. It places it there in the middle of the sacred canon, the crisis of a man who had a spiritual function and was failing to sustain the faith that his function required. The turning point of Psalm 73 is specific. Until I went into the sanctuary of God, then I discerned their end. Asaph did not emerge from the crisis through theological argumentation. He emerged through the change of perspective that the contemplative space produced, and when he emerged, he transformed the crisis into song, into one of the most honest and consoling psalms in the entire Psalter, exactly because it does not hide the process. Because Asaph's song is not from someone who never doubted. It is from someone who doubted to the limit and emerged with clarity on the other side. And this completely changes what your story has to offer to those who are still in the middle of doubt. What Asaph's story names for you, the experience you went through, including the moments of doubt, of envy, of weariness, from a faithfulness that seemed not to return, is not the chapter you need to hide before having something to offer. It is the chapter that makes what you have to offer verifiable, because someone in the middle of a crisis of faith does not need to hear from someone who never doubted. They need to hear from someone who doubted to the limit and yet did not let go. Asaph transformed his crisis into a maskil, the Hebrew word for a psalm of instruction that passes through difficulty. And this instruction has lasted millennia, exactly because it is too honest to be discarded. And then Habakkuk, the prophet who wrote the most disturbingly honest book of the entire Old Testament, and who ended it with one of the most radical declarations of faith ever recorded. The entire book of Habakkuk begins as a direct complaint to the Eternal. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not hear? It is not a poetic introduction. It is the voice of a man who is genuinely angry at the silence, genuinely confused by what he sees around him, genuinely without an answer to the question of why the righteous suffer while the unjust prosper. And the text records this cry without editing, without the softening that surface religiosity would expect. But chapter 3, the final chapter, is where the pattern completes itself in a way that will stay with you. Habakkuk reaches the most radical point possible. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. The English translation loses something that the original Hebrew captures. This is not the speech of someone who has reached a place of emotional peace. It is the declaration of someone who chose, deliberately, consciously, in the absence of any emotional evidence that justified the choice, to align their will with what they believe to be true, even when the feeling points in the opposite direction. And the sacred text records that Habakkuk transformed this entire process into a poem, into a song, with instructions for the choir master on how it should be sung. The most honest crisis of the prophetic text was delivered not as a report, but as music, because music has the capacity to contain contradiction, lament and praise, doubt and declaration, pain and hope, without needing to resolve the tension to transmit it. And it is exactly this capacity to contain contradiction that makes authentic art more powerful than any argument. Go to the comments now and write one word, transfigured, in capital letters, not as a description of what you already completely are, but as a declaration of the process that is happening in what you lived. The pain was not in vain. The weight was not wasted. It is being transfigured. Transfigured. What Hebrew and Greek say about music and testimony. Let's deepen the vocabulary, because the original words reveal dimensions that conventional translations cannot preserve. Zamar, zamar. It is the Hebrew word most frequently translated as to sing or to make music in the Psalms. But the root of the word reveals something that goes beyond sound production. Zamar has the same root as a word that means to prune, to cut away what is superfluous so that what has life can grow. The image is disturbingly precise. The act of making music from an intense experience is an act of pruning, of removing what is noise to reveal what is essential, of cutting away the layers of defensive narrative, of justification, of self-protection, and letting what is genuinely real emerge in sound. The Federal University of Bahia, which has one of the most respected ethnomusicology and music therapy research programs in Brazil, has documented in clinical and community contexts what contemplative traditions already knew. The process of transforming intense experience into musical form is not just expressive, it is integrative. The act of zamar, in the fullest sense of the Hebrew word, is a process by which the experience that was fragmented in emotional memory begins to receive structure, rhythm, contour, form, that the nervous system can process differently than it could when the experience was just accumulated weight. In other words, making music with what you went through is not an escape from what happened. It is the process by which what happened stops being just a burden and begins to have the dimension of zamar, pruned, refined, capable of growing into something that nourishes instead of just weighing down. The second word, tehillah, tila, translated as praise but the root halal from which tehillah comes, does not mean just producing a sound of praise. It means to shine, to radiate, to make visible. Tehillah is the act of making visible what was hidden, not in public performance, but in the revelation of what is genuinely real about the nature of the one being praised, through the quality of the act of praising. And the plural of Tehillah, Tehillim, is the Hebrew name for the entire book of Psalms. The book is not called songs or hymns, it is called acts of making visible. The entire book is a collection of moments in which human experience, in all its complexity, contradiction, and density, was used to make visible what would otherwise be invisible. The third word, mashil, mashkil, the title that appears in 13 of the Psalms, including Asaf's Psalm 73. The root sakal means to be wise, to have discernment, to navigate complexity with understanding. Mashil is the psalm of instruction that passes through difficulty, not the psalm that avoids difficulty to get straight to the celebration. It is the musical format that says, I will lead you through this, not around this. And the instruction that the Mashil carries is more powerful exactly because it does not deny the process, because it is honest enough about the path to be useful for those who are still on it. And the fourth word, from the Greek anamnesis, translated as remembrance or memorial, but which in the original Greek is not simply the act of recalling something that passed. Anamnesis is the representation, the making present of something that happened, so that it is not just recalled in memory, but experienced again in its essential dimension. It is the term used in Eucharistic theology to describe what happens in the Lord's Supper, not a simple memory of the historical event, but the making present of the reality that the event carries. When a song produces in you that recognition that stops time, the sensation that what is playing carries something of your story, what is happening is a form of anamnesis. The music is making present a dimension of an experience that was stored in layers that language does not reach. And this making present is not just emotional, it is integrative. It is the process by which the experience that was fragmented begins to receive narrative coherence. Researchers at Johns Hopkins University, in studies on grief processes and trauma integration, documented that exposure to art that resonates with experiences of loss frequently precipitates what they call windows of integration, periods of greater emotional plasticity in which memories that were blocked in their processing can begin to be reorganized into a coherent narrative. Art does not cause this by suggestion or placebo. It causes it through a real neurological mechanism. The anamnesis that music produces temporarily opens access to the layers where the memory was stored and offers the structure that was missing so that processing can happen. In other words, when a song makes you cry without being able to explain why, something irrational is not happening. Something is happening that is more precise than most of the conversations you tried to have on the same topic. Zamar, Tehillah, Mashil, anamnesis are happening. The encounter of a sound frequency with something in you that was waiting for exactly that structure to begin to move. What transfigured pain produces that untransfigured pain cannot. There is a distinction that Isaiah 61 articulates in a way that never leaves the mind of those who absorb what is being said. The text describes the purpose of the Anointed Ones, calling to give a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a faint spirit. Not the removal of ashes, the transformation of ashes into a crown, not the forgetting of mourning, the transmutation of mourning into joy, not the suppression of the faint spirit, the transfiguration of the faint spirit into Tehillah. The distinction is fundamental, because there is a popular version of the narrative of overcoming that suggests that what you lived will become irrelevant when what comes after is good enough, that the pain will lose importance in the face of the blessing. that the difficult chapter will be forgotten when the next one is radiant enough. But that is not the pattern of the sacred text. The pattern of the sacred text is that the pain does not disappear, it is transfigured. The scars do not vanish, they become credentials. The ashes are not removed, they are transmuted into the substance of the crown. And that is exactly why what you have to offer is not what you would have to offer if your path were easier. What you have to offer is proportional to what you went through, because transfiguration preserves the texture of the original while transforming what it can do. The University of Melbourne conducted extensive research on what researchers call empathic resonance in aesthetic experience. Why certain works of art produce an intense emotional response in people who have not lived the specific experience the work portrays. The most significant finding, the authenticity of the original experience, the detectable presence that what was transformed into art was truly lived, that it is not an intellectual construction but a genuine testimony, is the most determining factor of the emotional response. People do not respond to technical competence, they respond to the real weight that technical competence is transmitting. In other words, what makes a song stop someone in the middle of an ordinary afternoon is not the production, it is the truth it carries. And the truth it carries is detectable because it was transfigured from something someone actually lived, not manufactured from an imagination of what it would be like to live it. This completely changes the value you attribute to what you went through. Not the therapeutic value of having survived, the communicative value of what your experience, transfigured, can do in the life of someone who is still in the middle of the process you have already crossed. Researchers at Princeton University, who study the conditions for what they call emotional frequency resonance in shared narrative contexts, documented that the neurological response of those who hear an authentic story, one that carries the real weight of experience, not just the narrative structure of how a story should sound, activates regions of the listener's brain that mirror the active regions in the narrator. There is, literally, a neural synchrony between the one who carries the experience and the one who receives it when the transmission is authentic. This synchrony is what happens when a song stops you in the middle of an afternoon. It is what happens when someone cries upon hearing a song without knowing why. The real frequency of what was transfigured finds what is stored in the listener and produces recognition before any conscious processing. And this is not an accident or an inexplicable mystery. It is the mechanism by which Tehillah works, the act of making visible what was invisible through someone who went through the process of Zamar, of pruning, of letting what is genuinely essential emerge. Your story, Transfigured, has this potential, not because you are extraordinary compared to others, but because what you carried has the real weight that the process of transfiguration converts into a frequency that others recognize. Turn on the notification bell now, because the next video will be direct and uncomfortable in a necessary way. We are going to talk about what prevents transfiguration from happening, the 3 patterns of blockage that keep experience as accumulated weight instead of as a transformative testimony. We will name why people who went through intense cycles frequently get stuck in the identity of the struggle, even after the struggle has passed, and what is necessary for the process of Zamar to begin. It is not what you expect. Turn on the bell to be here when that video comes out. The protocol of transfiguration. Let's be practical, because what you have heard so far needs a landing point. The first movement is to identify what is still stored without form. There is a difference between the experiences you can already narrate with distance, which have already received the form of a story, with a beginning, development, and what you learned, and the experiences that still feel heavy when touched, that still produce that contraction that is not catalogued sadness, but present weight. Experiences of the second type have not yet passed through Zamar. They have not yet been pruned to the essential. They are still in raw format, and raw format does not transmit, it only weighs. It is not necessary for you to become a composer or a poet for this process. Zamar does not require an instrument or public performance. It requires enough honesty to stop abbreviating what is real, and enough space to let the experience be what it is before being transformed into an acceptable social narrative. The first stage is simply to stop summarizing what is not yet ready to be summarized, and to create space where the experience can exist in its most honest form, even if that form is still confusing and contradictory. The second movement is to receive the external testimony that is already arriving. There is a form of recognition that does not happen in speech. It happens in music, in art, in narratives that resonate with what you carry. And there is a practice of attention that some psychologists and spiritual therapists call active reception, the deliberate posture of receiving what arrives from the outside as potentially relevant to the internal process, instead of discarding it as coincidence or entertainment. When a song stops you, when a book has a sentence that seems written for you, when a video describes something you thought only you felt, the practice of active reception is not to let that moment escape without record. Not because the moment was supernatural, but because the nervous system is signaling that there is something there that found a layer that normally remains inaccessible. This signal deserves deliberate attention, not just a passing emotion. The third movement is to give what you carry a destination beyond yourself. Asaf did not write Psalm 73 just to process his own crisis. He composed it with instructions for the choir master, with the intention that it be delivered for use in the sanctuary, so that others who went through the same crisis could find there what he had found in crossing it. Complete transfiguration happens when what was integrated begins to be delivered. Not necessarily in song, not necessarily in a public format, but in some way that allows what you processed to serve someone who is still at the point where you once were. This could be an honest conversation with someone who is at the beginning of a cycle you have already crossed. It could be the right silence at the right moment, the presence of someone who knows what the other person is going through without needing to explain. It could be something you create, write, build, organize, teach. The form matters less than the direction. What was transfigured in you needs to have a destination beyond you to complete the process of Zamar. The fourth movement is learning to recognize anamnesis when it arrives. When the song stops you, when art touches the layer where memory is stored, that moment is not to be simply felt and let pass. It is a window of access to something your nervous system usually keeps protected. The practice is to use it deliberately. What in me is this music finding? What experience is being made present? What part of my story has not yet received enough form to be integrated? These questions, asked with honesty in the space that anamnesis opens, are the beginning of maskil, of the instruction that passes through difficulty instead of bypassing it. And the answers that arrive in these moments have a different quality than the answers that arrive during ordinary analytical thought, because they are accessing layers that analytical thought cannot reach by the direct route. What the song is saying. Let's close the way this episode asked from the beginning, with honesty about what music reveals. There is no song by a famous musician that was written specifically about you. That statement would be manipulation, and you deserve more than that. But there is something that is more significant and more real than any manufactured narrative could be. There is a frequency that what you lived produces when transfigured with honesty that other people recognize in the body before processing with the mind. This frequency does not need a famous musician to exist. It exists in you, in the real weight of what you carried, in the faithfulness you demonstrated when no one was measuring, in the honesty of your process, with all the Asaf moments, all the moments when you were on the verge of letting go and did not let go. The pain you carried in silence was not witnessed the way it deserved. Yes, it was not, and that hurts in a way that no consoling statement will completely erase. But what Miriam knew, what Asaf discovered in the crisis, what Habakkuk chose at the limit, is that the definitive testimony of experience does not come from those on the outside looking in. It comes from within, when the experience finally receives the form that allows it to be delivered. It comes from Zamar, from the pruning that reveals the essential. It comes from Tehillah, from the act of making visible what was hidden. It comes from Maskil, from the instruction that passes through difficulty with enough honesty to be useful for those who are still in it. The song that is being composed with what you lived is not by a famous musician. It is by you, still being written, still being refined, still being pruned until what is genuinely real can emerge without the armor of the abbreviated narrative. And when that song is ready, when the Zamar has done the work of pruning, it will make someone stop in the middle of an ordinary afternoon and feel that recognition that has no immediate logical explanation. Because the frequency of what was genuinely lived, genuinely crossed and genuinely transfigured is detectable by those who have ears to hear. If you know someone who is carrying a story that has not yet found the format to be understood, someone who gave up trying to explain what they went through because every attempt reduced what was real too much, send this video to that person now. Because sometimes what opens the process of transfiguration is simply the confirmation that what was lived deserves more than the abbreviated version that daily life accepts. And you can be the one who delivers that confirmation. See you in the next video.
Attention, you need to prepare now. I put together an exclusive resource for those who feel set apart for something greater, but live surrounded by noise, distractions, and mental overload. This is a 30-day journey that will transform your life, a guided path to armor your mind and prepare for what's coming, with daily practices of focus, boundaries, and discipline. Stop negotiating with the noise. Learn to spot distractions before they control you and strengthen your mind. Also available in an immersive audio version. Over 10,000 readers have already transformed their lives through the 30-day journey. Thousands of people have already started this transformation. People like you who were tired of living in the fog, ordinary people who decided to stop accepting mental chaos. Take advantage of this limited time offer only this month. Access your link just below in the pinned comment.